January 1793, Paris. A crowd fills Revolution Square. The guillotine sparkles in the January sun. Louis XVI's head falls into a basket, and tens of thousands of people scream with delight. A few months later, the same crowd will come to watch the same guillotine execute Robespierre, the man who organized these executions himself. In the 4 years of the French Revolution, 40 to 60,000 people were killed, not monarchists, by the revolutionaries themselves, each other. People who swore by reason, freedom, and brotherhood. People who publicly renounced Christianity and proclaimed the goddess of reason on the altar of Notre Dame Cathedral. It would seem that God was killed. They killed him completely. But instead of silence, something completely different came. New martyrs, new heretics, new inquisitions, just without crosses, just with different words. Look at the 20th century, the most atheistic century in human history. The Soviet Union blew up churches and shot priests. Nazi Germany proclaimed the cult of race and blood. Maoist China banned religion and staged a cultural revolution. 3 regimes, 3 ideologies, and all 3 created their own gods, their own prophets, their own sacred texts, and their own inquisitions, only under other names. Why is this happening? Why did people who rejected God in the name of reason invariably end up with something that looked scarier than medieval theocracy? Is there something in the very nature of man that requires not just an explanation of the world, but salvation from it? And if religion is a disease, then why do its symptoms come back again and again, even when the very word religion is banned? Today, we will walk this path together. From the moment when Europe decided that God was dead, to the moment when it became clear that millions of human lives were the price for his death. Not because atheism is bad, but because a person without the transcendent is not freed from the religious impulse. He just stops noticing it. To understand why atheism generates new religions, you first need to understand what exactly it killed. Because Christian theology did more than just one thing. She did several things at once, and each of them turned out to be irreplaceable. First of all, she explained suffering. If a person is sick, poor, or if his child is dying, Christianity had the answer. All this makes sense in the perspective of eternity. God sees the whole picture. Suffering redeems, purifies, and leads to something more. This does not mean that the pain is not real. It means that it is not the last word. In addition, religion provided a moral absolute. There are things that cannot be done, not because the majority has decided so, not because it is unprofitable, but because there is a court that is above any earthly verdict. The Last Judgment is not a fairy tale for children. It is a guarantee that the evil that escaped punishment here will not escape it anywhere. Finally, religion created a community, a common ritual, a common calendar, a common space of death and birth. People who prayed together, buried together, and celebrate together are bound by something that is not described by the contract. When European philosophers began to destroy this system in the 18th century, they did so with a completely sincere conviction. All of the above are illusions. Suffering is just suffering. Morality is a social contract. A community can be built on reason. Voltaire, Holbach, Rousseau, and later Feuerbach and Marx all believed that without God, man would become freer, more rational, and kinder. But they made one mistake. They thought that they could remove theology and leave the person untouched. It's as if thousands of years of religious thinking are just a layer of dirt that needs to be washed away to reveal a pure, rational subject. Something completely different was revealed underneath. When God died, the need for meaning, salvation, and the moral absolute did not die with him. She just started looking for another address. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He was a staunch atheist, called religion the opium of the people, and believed that it was she who kept the workers in submission, promising them retribution in heaven instead of justice on earth. Marx wanted justice here and now. But look at the structure of what he created. At the beginning is the fall from grace, the emergence of private property which destroyed primitive communism and gave rise to alienation. A person is alienated from his work, from other people, from himself. He's fallen. Before that moment, there was innocence. After that, there was history as suffering. Then comes the story of providence. Marx doesn't just describe capitalism, he explains why it will inevitably collapse. There are laws of historical development, the iron logic of dialectics which leads humanity to a predetermined goal. This is not an observation. This is eschatology, the doctrine of the end of time. The proletariat is the Messiah. It is he who carries the suffering of all mankind, and it is through his liberation that the whole world is liberated. Marx even has an analog of the sacrifice of the cross. The deeper exploitation, the greater the suffering of the working class, the closer the revolution is, the closer salvation is. Revolution is the apocalypse, the end of the old world, and communism is paradise. Literally, a state in which there is no state, no alienation, no class contradictions. The man has finally become himself. The story is over. When Marxism became the state ideology in Russia, this structure was deployed in full force. Sacred texts appeared, Capital and Manifesto. Prophets appeared, Marx, Engels, Lenin, whose works were quoted with the same intonation with which the gospel is quoted. Icons appeared, portraits of leaders that hung in the red corner instead of icons in the literal sense. Rituals appeared, party meetings with ritual voting, May Day processions with banners, the mausoleum as incorruptible relics. Inquisition appeared, party purges where the accused were forced to publicly repent of deviations and deviations. Soviet citizens who came out of orthodoxy did not come out of religious thinking, they continued it in a new shell. The same fear of trial, only the court was now called the Party Commission. The same promise of redemption through suffering, only suffering was now called a labor feat. The same terrible trial, only it did not take place after death, but during interrogation by the NKVD. But Marxism was international, its God was history, and its chosen people were the class. Almost simultaneously, another secular theology was born, based on something much older and much more dangerous, blood and earth. Nationalism as a political force appeared at about the same time as Marxism, in the 19th century, but its roots go deeper into the Romantic movement of the late 18th century, which itself was a reaction to the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment. The Romantics felt what the rationalists had not noticed. Man cannot live by reason alone. He needs belonging, not to humanity in the abstract, but to something concrete, warm, his own, to a language that sounds like childhood, to the land that the ancestors knew, to the songs my mother used to sing. This impulse was real and understandable. Nationalism took this impulse and gave it a theological framework. The nation has acquired features that used to belong to God. It is eternal. Nations have existed always, even when they did not exist as states. It requires sacrifice. Dying for the motherland is the highest virtue. It gives meaning. Individual life is insignificant, but the life given to the nation is immortal. The dead soldier didn't just die, he fell for his fatherland, and through this he gained eternity.
The German romantic Johann Gottlieb Fichte, in his speeches to the German nation of 1807 to 1808, created, in fact, the first detailed nationalist theology. The German people are special, Fichte said, not because Germans are better than other people, but because the German language is alive, primary, rooted in nature, unlike the Latin languages. Through the German spirit, humanity will come to its highest incarnation. This is a direct analog of the idea of the chosen people. When nationalism reached its extreme point in Nazi socialism, the theological structure became visible to the naked eye. Hitler's Mein Kampf is a sacred text with prophecies. The Nuremberg Congresses are a liturgy, torchlight processions, choral chants, ritual oaths, the appearance of the prophet in the ring of light. The Aryan is a being of a special nature, almost angelic in its purity, which is defiled by mixing with the inferior. This is the theology of the fall. The Holocaust had not only a political, but also a sacred logic. Purification from filth, a return to purity that existed before the fall. Eschatology, the millennial Reich, literally 1,000 years, a period taken from the Apocalypse of John. This is not a metaphor. The Nazi ideologists themselves used apocalyptic language quite deliberately. Nazism was largely a movement of people who were disillusioned with Christianity, but who had not freed themselves from the religious impulse. They took a religious structure, filled it with new content, and got something that had all the mobilizing power of religion, but was devoid of its universalist restraining principle. Christianity, for all its historical sins, said every human being is created in the image of God. Nationalism said, only ours.
Marxism promised paradise through class struggle. Nationalism is through the purification of blood. But in the 20th century, a third secular theology emerged, much milder at first glance and much more tenacious. The belief that progress alone leads humanity to salvation. Unlike Marxism and nationalism, the cult of progress did not build concentration camps. That is why his religious nature is the most difficult to notice. But it's there. Faith in progress was born out of the same enlightenment that killed God. The philosophers of the 18th century decided that history has a direction. Humanity is moving from darkness to light, from superstition to knowledge, from cruelty to humanity. This movement is unstoppable because knowledge accumulates, technology develops, and reason wins. At first glance, it's just optimism based on observations. But take a closer look at the structure. History has a direction and a purpose. It is providence. The past is darkness. The present is a transitional period, and the future is light. It's the same three-part scheme: the fall, the story as redemption, and paradise at the end. The cult of progress has its own version of the chosen ones, those who are on the right side of history. This expression is theological in itself. It suggests that history has a moral dimension and that certain people, by virtue of their views, are in agreement with its direction, while others are not. Being on the wrong side of history is heresy. Science in this system takes the place of Holy Scripture. It is authoritative, requires recognition, and doubt about it is interpreted as ignorance or malicious intent. Scientists and experts are clergymen who have access to the truth that is inaccessible to the uninitiated. Technological progress is a miracle that demonstrates the correctness of faith. The cult of progress has its own eschatology, which has only changed its form. In the 19th century, it was a positivist paradise where science would solve all problems. In the 20th, it is a technological utopia. Today, it is transhumanism, victory over death through technology, uploading consciousness, endless life. Immortality has returned. It's just that now it's not God who promises it, but Elon Musk and neural interfaces. The cult of progress differs from the first two in that it almost never recognizes itself as an ideology. It hides behind the words facts, science, rationality. But that doesn't make it less religious. It makes it more complacent. A religion that does not know it is a religion cannot criticize itself. 3 different ideologies, 3 different secular theologies, but all 3 have one common consequence, which is not customary to talk about out loud. And this consequence explains why the 20th century became the bloodiest in the history of mankind. When Christian theology talked about the Last Judgment, it did something very specific. It transferred absolute justice beyond the earthly life. This meant that no earthly court, no earthly ruler could claim to be absolutely right. Even the most powerful tyrant knew, theoretically, that there was a higher court above him. This created a limit. When God died, the limit disappeared. Now, justice had to be done here. The revolutionary tribunal, the party purge, the racial court, all of them assumed the function of the Last Judgment, but without its main limitation. They were terrestrial, and therefore fundamentally capable of arbitrariness.
Moreover, secular theologies demanded from their adherents the same thing that religion demanded: willingness to die for the faith. But they removed what religion gave in return: personal immortality and solace. In Christianity, a martyr goes to God. In the Revolution, the martyr goes into oblivion, but his name will be inscribed in history. This exchange is much less profitable and therefore requires much tougher enforcement. That is why the secular theologies of the 20th century turned out to be much more violent than the religious wars of the past. Religious wars were terrible, but in the 400 years of its existence, the Inquisition has imposed about 3,000 death sentences. The Soviet Troika shot more than 350,000 people in 1937 alone. The scale is incomparable. Why? Because religious judgment is at least theoretically limited. There is sin, there is repentance, there is forgiveness. A secular court does not know forgiveness for an ideological deviation, it only knows correction or destruction. And since salvation must be achieved in history, procrastination means betrayal. Since heaven is possible on earth, those who interfere with the construction are doubly guilty. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote about this with the utmost clarity. Metaphysical rebellion, the rejection of God, inevitably turns into political terror when a person tries to assume the function of providence. By killing God, man has not freed himself from the desire for paradise. He just decided to build it with his own hands. And everything that interfered with the construction was to be demolished. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who went through the Soviet Gulag, put it differently, but no less accurately. The people who guarded it sincerely believed that they were doing a great job. They were not sadistic by nature. They were believers, but in a different faith. And that's what made them scarier than ordinary villains. Villains can be stopped by force, believers only by destroying their faith. But if secular theologies carry the seeds of violence, does this mean that a return to traditional religion is the way out? Or is the problem deeper, in the very nature of what a person needs and in how he copes with it? It would be too easy to end this conversation with a call to return to the church, because traditional religions also knew their inquisitions, their crusades, their bonfires. The problem is not that atheism is bad, but Christianity is good. The problem is that man is a being who needs meaning, community, moral absolution, and a response to death. And when these needs do not receive an honest, informed response, they receive a dishonest and unconscious one. Sociologist Emil Durkheim wrote back in 1912 that religion is not a belief system about the supernatural.
Religion is what binds people into a community around the sacred. The sacred can be anything: God, nation, class, progress, ecology, identity. The form changes, but the function remains. This does not mean that all these things are equivalent. Religions and ideologies can be assessed by how resistant they are to abuse, how much they protect human dignity regardless of whether they belong to a select group, and how much they allow criticism and self-correction. According to these criteria, the secular theologies of the 20th century failed catastrophically. They had no inhibitory mechanism because they did not recognize themselves as beliefs.
This is where the main lesson is. It's not about believing in God. The point is that you need to see your beliefs as beliefs. A person who knows that he has a picture of the world and that this picture is incomplete is protected from fanaticism. A person who thinks that he has no picture of the world, but only facts and science, is defenseless, because he doesn't notice the moment when his worldview turns into a religion. Soviet ideologists were convinced that they were working with scientific Marxism. Nazi theorists considered racial biology to be a rigorous science. The apologists of limitless progress today are convinced that their belief in technological salvation is just realism. None of these groups called themselves believers. The philosopher William James wrote, "The question is not whether you have a religious impulse. The question is, what are you doing with it? You can direct it to something that expands empathy and limits power, or to something that concentrates power and destroys empathy." The history of the 20th century is the story of what happens when the second option takes over, and its adherents do not even suspect that they are making a choice. We started with Paris in 1793, from a guillotine that worked in the name of reason. Now we can see that there was nothing paradoxical about this scene, provided that we understand exactly what happened. Reason has not replaced religion. It put on her clothes. And when religious thinking is stripped of its traditional limitations, hierarchy, canon, and the transcendental court, it doesn't become harmless. It's getting more dangerous. Marxism, nationalism, and the cult of progress are not accidental delusions. These are natural products of a situation in which a religious impulse has been left without an honest answer. They filled the void left after God's death and filled it with the same structures that they had known before: the chosen people, the holy text, the Messiah, the apocalypse, paradise. The price that humanity has paid for this unconscious exchange is tens of millions of lives. It's not because people became angrier. It's because they became fanatics who didn't know they were fanatics. And this is perhaps the most dangerous state a person can be in: to believe deeply and at the same time be convinced that you are just looking at the facts. The way out of this trap is not to give up the search for meaning. That search is unavoidable. The way out is to be honest with yourself, to admit that each of us has a picture of the world that includes something like the sacred, to admit that this picture is incomplete, and to build it in such a way that it leaves room for doubt, for another person, and for a court that is higher than any earthly tribunal, even if everyone understands this court in their own way. Because history has shown that humanity is not capable of the greatest atrocities when it believes too much, and then when it stops noticing what it believes in.